Devin, if you recall, when I agreed to do this podcast, I did it under one condition. You promised me one thing for doing this podcast. Do you remember what that was?
I have no memory of this.
Well, that promise was that I could do one episode entirely of my own choosing in terms of the topic.
Well, that seems fair. What do you want to do it on?
We are going to do it, an entire episode, digging into the greatest sci-fi series of all time.
Star Wars,
No,
The Expanse,
no,
Battlestar Galactica,
no,
doing aliens again,
nope,
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy,
no,
Chris Marker's La Jetée,
nope,
Star Wars,
no,
Foundation,
no, close, no,
Book of the New Sun,
no,
Star Trek.
no, wait, yes, Star Trek.
Oh man.
You're tall, but I'm standing in front of you.
It's a podcast.
Welcome to You're Tall, but I'm Standing in Front of You, the podcast where two friends circling the drain of academia examine the cultural detritus of the 20th century. I'm Devin.
I'm Ethan.
And Ethan, we're moving a little off theme today, away from the detritus part to actually talk about something you like very much. Why don't you tell the listeners what we're doing today?
Yes, so I have convinced you to chat a little bit about Star Trek. Finally, we've gone the whole season. We haven't done any of it. And I finally convinced you to not even agree to do an episode on Star Trek, but sort of a double hitter with Star Trek: The Motion Picture and 2009's Star Trek. But on top of that, we also have a very special guest with us for this episode. Just pulling out all the stops because I want to make sure that you really get a lot out of this, Devin.
Yeah. Well, you don't know if I'm going to let you do this again, so you have to.
Yeah.
You have to cram as much content into this episode as you can, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we are joined by Will Nguyen for this episode. You may know him on Twitter as the Star Trek communist at Boomer9er. And Will, we are just so excited for you to be joining us for this conversation about Star Trek: The Motion Picture and Star Trek 2009.
I'm very excited. This is probably a great time to tell you I'm actually the Star Wars capitalist instead. I'm joking. Although I do enjoy Star Wars, I definitely don't enjoy capitalism. But the two things are all intertwined, and excited to talk about it.
Excellent. I think it maybe will help a little bit just to preface with like our history with Star Trek, just briefly. I know I can say that I really enjoy Star Trek. I've seen all the films, all of the shows. There are many layers of experts beyond me, I would say. But it's definitely something that I enjoy. I started out watching it back when it was on. They'd have like next gen reruns on like TBS when I was in high school, and I'd be able to run home for lunch and like watch part of an episode. At that time, that was like when I first got into Star Trek. Wasn't until like high school, so I missed a lot of it when it was live on air for that kind of next gen, the like Berman era run. But then I kind of fell in love with it then, and then going into college and watching through all of the original series films, and then now I cannot seem to get enough of it. Whereas Devin, I think you've never had that much of that experience.
Yeah, like I'm not anti Star Trek in any way. It's kind of surprising I'm not more of a Star Trek fan. Just I'm very much in the demographic you would think would be a Star Trek fan of just like Marxist-y sci-fi nerds, right? But it was really more of just a an access thing, I guess. Like it was just kind of arbitrary. It's like I grew up, I had the Star Wars trilogy on VHS, those editions that have like the half of the faces on them. I don't know if you guys know
I do.
those
Was
covers.
was Vader kind of like reddish, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then I think there's maybe a Yoda.
There's a Yoda one.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the third one is, but
Was it a
I grew up with-
stormtrooper?
Yes, yes, I think so.
I know that version well.
Nice. Yeah. So grew up with those, watched those all the time. And, it's like, you can get the main story in just those three films. There's obviously the whole universe, the expanded universe to explore, but Star Trek, I would like brush up against it on occasion, especially like some of the movies, right? Like I do remember seeing First Contact. I remember in general having sort of a liking Data for whatever reason. Was one of the characters I was drawn to. I remember when that actor shows up in Independence Day as the doctor.
That's right.
That is going to cut the alien open. And then I remember seeing, unfortunately, Star Trek Nemesis in theaters. Probably the only pre-Abrams Star Trek I saw, like when it came out. But just never had in like a pre-streaming era, in an era before I knew how to torrent and stuff, didn't have access to like the shows, which are like, where the bulk of Star Trek's happening. So I'm coming into this having seen, maybe an episode here or there of like Next Generation, but much at a disadvantage in this episode.
Yeah. So Will, I'd be curious on your end, and maybe I'd start this question with like, do you like Star Trek because you're communist, or do you like communism because you're Trekkie? Where does one start and the other begin?
Right. So first off, I think, Ethan, you can't sell yourself short, because I see in the background, probably the listeners can't see because it's an audio medium, but you have the soundtrack to the motion picture, the great, tricolor, rainbow colored cover of that soundtrack, which is great. And you have the United Federation of Planets flag. That is, that's definitely not a fair weather fan. So I think you sell yourself short. So that's really great. But at the same time, I think on to Devin's point, I think now there are 900 plus episodes of Star Trek, 13 plus movies, all the books, all the comics. It is very daunting, right? It becomes, the canon really becomes this thing that becomes, daunting to people, but in a way that speaks to the ability for the franchise to kind of take different forms, right? And obviously there's debate about what forms are the best and why does it take a certain particular form too. And I think, to answer your question, Ethan, I would say obviously, I didn't grow up a Marxist. I didn't grow up to be a communist. I was a Star Trek fan first, right? And I came across Star Trek, much like a lot of people of my generation. I'm a late millennial, if you will, kind of born in '86, the year of the Voyage Home, the year of the whale movies. So Next Generation was then in syndication when I was of 6, 7, 8, right? So you would see it. I would see it out of order. But over time, I was able to kind of get my entry point that way. And then over time, discover the fact that there was an original series, and the original series movies, and all of the subsequent spinoffs. Deep Space Nine is my favorite. We can talk more about why, maybe on another episode. But I think in a lot of ways, the spinoffs were kind of where my fandom really exploded. And in a lot of ways, my journey towards revolutionary politics kind of came later on as well, but took the same trend that many other people of my generation took as well. We grew up and we came of age in a time of capitalist crisis. And that plays a huge role, right? Experience is the greatest teacher, right? So, that shaped a bunch of my politics, and then kind of discovering the fact that the two overlap, but maybe not in a conscious way, because I don't think Gene Roddenberry was a conscious Marxist in any way, was a conscious revolutionary in any way. But the ideas beg for a materialist analysis. It begs for an analysis of where human society is going and where it isn't going. And so I think in a way, it was such a natural fit because the very setting of Star Trek is a one world government on Earth that have abolished national borders for all intents and purposes, right? They unite into one world government where they don't talk about greed. They don't talk about profit. They talk about not being familiar with money, not having money, working to better oneself, right? These are all kind of ideas that, it's literally knocking at the door of communism, whether it realizes it or whether it wants to or not. It begs that question. So it's like the easiest slam dunk to kind of tie the two together. And then in some ways, it kind of makes me a better Star Trek fan because I used to be a Star Trek fan, and I think Ethan knows. There's a lot of Star Trek fans that love that minutia, that love like, well, this isn't canon, and this contradicts things and whatever. And like over time, much like with Star Wars and everything else, like I've learned to let go of like, things are not going to always line up, although they line up pretty well. So I take from it what I enjoy the most, and I actually use it to explain to people ideas that would otherwise be perhaps too they might be too hostile to it, right? But just to say, in the Star Trek universe, do they have health insurance premiums in the future, right? Does Beverly Crusher charge you to just give you a hypo spray, right? Do they get paid? Like, does Data get paid and he pays rent to Picard? Like, no, it doesn't happen, right? They exist, right? They exist to better oneself. That's in fact, Data's entire existence is to better oneself, right? In fact, they have all the free time. Well, not all the free time, but they have tremendous free time. Even the regular crew people to learn Shakespeare, dead languages, participate in plays, to really do all those types of things where in reality, you're like, wait a minute, we don't have that under capitalism, far from it. And it's the easiest connection to make, like, why don't we have that world? Why does that world seem so increasingly remote? Is it just a question of technology? Like, do we just need replicators that just have magic things appear in a box? Or is there something else? There's a political question. And I think that's the easiest way to explain to people, like, a post-scarcity society is in fact communism, right? In fact, like it is, and we'll go into it, but I think that is, in a way, it's made me a better Marxist, but also made me a better Star Trek fan, because I take what I enjoy the most out of it. I don't sweat the details. I don't sweat all of this and that. And I think I enjoy it far more than other people that just like, this ship doesn't look like the way it looked 55 plus years ago, right? So.
All right.
Yeoman?
Yes, sir.
I thought I told you that when I'm on the bridge, I excite.
But you wanted the reports by 0500. It's 0500 now, sir.
Thank you. I get used to having a woman on the bridge. No offense, Lieutenant. You're different, of course.
I think it's a great point of how like the Star Trek universe can be a great way to explore the reality of that the future of the human civilization and all of that. I think it's also an interesting way to explore that recognition that Star Trek is largely written by liberals, and so like sometimes you can look at the stories presented there and what it has to say about the future, and some discordance of like, well, why did they make that decision? And because Star Trek is written by real flawed people, and so it's natural that some of themselves are going to come into that work. Especially, I think you see a lot of that with Gene Roddenberry in the original series and in the motion picture. But I feel like there's multiple levels there of that sort of discussion of thinking about Star Trek and thinking about it in terms of those post-scarcity or those Marxist terms that. I think you're right. There's a lot of conversation to be had that in ways that is accessible to a lot of folks to unpack that just with a pretty broad audience.
Yeah. And Will, what you were saying about the way it's kind of almost unconscious in Star Trek. And again, like, I'm not I haven't seen most of the show and everything, but like from the Star Trek I have seen, thinking about it in contrast to like texts that are trying to depict post-scarcity societies, that are actually written by Marxists or people that are actually like really trying to like explain a post-scarcity society to you. They need not be a Marxist, actually. There's a lot of pretty fascisty post-scarcity sci-fi out there. But I'm thinking even of like a novel like Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. I don't know if any of you know this novel. It's a late 19th century novel. It actually inspired a bunch of like utopian societies. It doesn't really have a plot. Like its plot is that a guy like literally like Rip Van Winkles himself into the future. There's a very thin explanation given. And then like a guy walks around and like explains to him how society works. And that's a totally interesting novel, but doesn't exactly capture the imagination in a way that like Star Trek does, right? And what's interesting to me is the way in which like it's not so much that Star Trek spends a lot of time necessarily explicating all the little intricacies of these of its post-scarcity nature, so much as it, like the way you were talking about it, well, it's like there's things that are just not there. Like there's things that are absent that to us we think of as like inherent parts of reality, whether it's health insurance premiums, like having to work for a wage, right? Things that seem like just part of realism. And it seems like it would have this like effectiveness as just you can look at someone and say like, okay, you love the kind of world that is the kind of activities that are going on in the Star Trek world and would like to participate in those activities yourself. What are the like political social conditions that would enable that, right? Seems a lot more effective than like handing someone a novel that's just like, and here's how we will, here's how the labor vouchers will work, and here's where the commissary will be located. But
yeah. So I want to dig in a bit. I know we are chatting specifically with Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Star Trek 09. I'm sure it is easy to leak out into some of the other pieces of Star Trek, which is fine as well. But I know we first got interested in this because there's this new 4K director's cut of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which is really gorgeous. And I showed it to Devin for the first time. He had never seen any of the previous cuts of the motion picture. And I think we were blown away with a lot of the effects and just sort of more broadly, I think I found going back and rewatching it this time, the overarching themes as well, I found super interesting and compelling. And, kind of, you can see a lot of Gene Roddenberry's humanism in what he's trying to say as a film. But we're not going to spend a ton of time on plot for the sake of plot. But to frame this, if we were to describe the plot of the motion picture in one sentence, I don't know, do either of you have how you would perhaps try and summarize it as such?
So what I had was a man kills himself so that he can have sex with a computer while some other people hang out for the first time in a while.
That's one reading there.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I mean, that's the thing about the motion picture. I love the motion picture. I think it's really going through a sort of renaissance or reappraisal in a lot of ways. And again, this is there's a lot about the history, the making of the motion picture. I mean, I know, Ethan, I'm sure you're familiar with it. I think Devin may not be, and other listeners, about how fraught this production was, right? How phase 2 and Planet of the Titans was all kind of wrapped up into the development process, why it was so over budget. They pre-sold the movies on December 7th, so they had to release, otherwise it'd be sued by all the theaters. They had to switch VFX from, Able Associates to Trumbull. I mean, this is very like that's like Star Trek nerd stuff, right? And so interesting. But the ideas of it is, at the end of the day, it's the most. Sometimes I shun away from saying the most Star Trek, because that could be a type of like gatekeeping to say like, oh well, this is the only real type of Star Trek and what have you. And there are many types of iterations, and it needs to change to survive. But I think Star Trek Motion Picture holds up because there's a bigger idea there, right? There's this grander scope there, and yet it feels like there's a genuine, especially if you watch the original series, right? And you see the restored scenes that are in there with Spock reacting and crying to V'ger. The emotions between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy have never been better. And it's that development of that relationship is what TOS was. Original series was really about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, right? The two halves of Kirk, the emotion, the logic, and kind of coming to it. It's the relationship between those three individuals, right? But this movie then expanded it to a different scale. It felt like an episode of TOS, like The Changeling, right? It was also based off of a Phase 2 script, In Thy Image, right? But then it actually has the scope of cinema, right? A cinematic, it's the motion picture, right? It even sounds a little pretentious, right? Directed by Robert Wise, all kind of stuff. And even the trailers was narrated by Orson Welles, right? Like and it has that 2001 Space Odyssey kind of thing to it, right? Where at the time there was a reaction to it, like, hey, this doesn't look like that Technicolor, colorful pajama look that of the 60s, right? The very go-go-ish of it. It seems very muted, right? And all that kind of stuff. Like, but in a way, like what is old is new again, right? So that retro futurism from that 70s, right, it has an appeal again, that nostalgia coming again, right? The idea that the central conceit is, there's not an enemy per se. There's not really an antagonist, but clearly just someone that we don't understand how to communicate with this thing, right? So there's some deeper themes there, right? There's also, like, of course, like the horniness of what Roddenberry brings into it, which, right, which I think is part and parcel of what that type of Star Trek is, especially with Gene kind of at the helm of it. You see a lot of that in early Next Generation, right? So Decker and Ilea are proto Riker and Troy, right? You see that through line, like that's where it's going to come. In the novelization, Roddenberry talks about new humans, right? A different type of humans are starting to evolve on Earth that differ from Starfleet, right? You see the proto ideas of what he would then take to the Next Generation, right? That 24th century utopianism that Picard especially embodies in the first seasons. So it's really interesting to kind of see, like, that is the motion picture really is like the thing in between the original series where the show that got canceled early, got saved by the fans, and at some point transformed itself into, it's not a belief system, but it was more than just a show now. It was more than just Wagon Train to the Stars, which is what Roddenberry initially wanted. It's like, I want to tell some allegories. We'll tell it like a Western in space. And the 6-shooters are phasers, right? And at some point, he himself changed, like, wait a minute, I can actually say something far deeper, right? Like, man has moved beyond poverty, moved beyond greed, moved beyond want in such a direction, in such a big shift, right? And motion picture was the reason why that happened. And I think director's cut, director's edition in 4K, I think people can kind of see, like, how it was really meant to be seen. And I think in a way, Star Trek has never felt as grandiose, right? So if you see that Enterprise, you see the wreck deck scene where they're all laid out. All those extras, by the way, are Star Trek fans from the 70s that, like, won a contest to come. The ship feels teeming. It actually feels full of life. Those are all built out sets, right? Actual models, that's not CG. It has a tangibleness, the shadows, the way it hits on it. I think it has a grandeur that no other movie has really hit on since then. There are other Star Trek movies that are also really great too, don't get me wrong, but I think motion picture, will always be like the most grandiose for a lot of reasons, and it's very underappreciated because it is slower. It is a little slower. It's a little more deliberate, and in a way, I'm glad we're comparing it to 2009, because 2009 is the exact opposite in a lot of ways, for better and for worse. But I think it does say there's also a meta narrative too, which I'll get to later, but there's also a meta narrative as to why Star Trek is the way that it is now. And it's actually a direct result of the crisis of liberalism, the crisis of capitalism, and how, like, you can't envision a better world. So it's then reflected back in your media. It's reflected back into, like, this kind of dourness that you see in a lot of media nowadays.
That's great. What you're talking about with the grandeur, right? That's so great. And I just want to point out, because I don't think we've explicitly said it, that we're in this film comes out in 1979, right? Which is longtime listeners may remember our Aliens episode. right, where we talked about the opening scene of Aliens, which Alien is also 1979. Am I right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Aliens, right? We talked about that. The opening shots of that film, in some ways, are kind of staging the grandeur of 1970s sci-fi film, just to later abandon it and embrace this sort of 1980s like kind of action film aesthetics. In this film, we are very much getting like we are getting like a full dose of like, this film is absolutely gorgeous. Like I just want to be clear, I loved watching it. And it also comes out the same year as Alien, and then also Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, which maybe my favorite science fiction film of all time, but also one that is incredibly slow, deliberate, long shots, makes the viewer sit in duration, right? And we're in the like late 70s, we're in the stagflation years, right? We're really we're being forced to like sit with these images that are also kind of transcendent. It's a hell of a year for sci-fi cinema, and I never quite realized that until watching this one for the first time.
I think it's also fascinating that you can see Star Trek the Motion Picture go through so many years of production hell. You can see it coming out 2 years after Star Wars, and it's very much not Star Wars. There is that beyond just some of the, and I think Star Wars has its own sort of grandiose visual effects, but there is that quintessential 70s feel, I feel, to the Star Trek the Motion Picture that captures sort of an immensity of what you are dealing with in ways that like you can compare shots like when the Enterprise is inside of V'ger, the mysterious ship that is advancing towards Earth, which you get a sense of the immensity through these visuals of they have the tiny little Enterprise there on the screen versus the larger V'ger. Now you can compare that, like if we're talking about 2009, you have kind of that opening shot of the USS Kelvin versus Nero's ship and just the immense differences in size. But there's something about, I don't know if it's the like matte paintings and the use of models, but you can feel the immensity. I feel it hits differently when you're looking at those shots versus some of the CGI shots that are impressive in their own way, but are a different kind of beast to me than the feeling that gives off.
Yeah, you don't feel the physicality, right? Like what Will was saying about the way the lighting works in this film, because lights are actually hitting physical objects, right? Like there's just something kind of irreproducible about that, I think.
Yeah, you even have how they filmed some of the scenes with it. You're like, why is it blurry in the middle? Because they filmed it to try and have dual focus, so you can see people close up and people in the back, and it's sort of fuzzy in the middle between them. But that's how it was captured on film, and so that's what you're seeing even when you're watching this 4K remaster. To say the least, it's very different from what you'd sort of get from the direction of someone like J.J. Abrams in their kind of vision and style of the Enterprise.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Ethan, I can't see you right now because there's just a lot of lens flare getting in the way of your sorry. You can edit that out. That's low hanging fruit.
So one thing that probably goes across both of these films and beyond into Star Trek as a property overall, there's this theme around Spock and Spock's identity. And it comes up in both the motion picture, it comes up in Star Trek 2009. And I think it plays into the larger theme, especially of Star Trek the motion picture, of almost this idea, like, what does it mean to be human? There's this question of, can you simply quantify everything? Is that the totality of existence, simply like breaking it down to data and quantity, versus what is captured in some of these qualitative aspects of what it means to be human that you can't capture that way? I think it's centered on the Spock character. So I was thinking maybe we could just chat a little bit about what that theme means to all of you as you see it in these films, this question of what it means to be human, how do we find connections with other humans, and maybe how does that theme fit into some of the larger conversation we're having?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways you could see how Spock is the linchpin of the entire Star Trek universe. And I love so there's a Star Trek. So there's three kind of tracks that I take my Star Trek fan. There's what's on screen, right? So like what's on the movies, TV screen. That's the one story, stuff on Memory Alpha. There's also the behind the scenes, right? So like the production, which is also incredibly interesting, right? Is how all this was produced, written, conceived of, funded, not funded, that kind of stuff too. And there's also the other one, which is kind of the one I've kind of added into, which is like, what's the Marxist analysis of like what Star Trek is, right? And the two interplay, right? You can analyze all those types of things, right? And you can kind of see how Spock really became the linchpin in a lot of ways, because he was that linchpin, had some friction with William Shatner for a very long time, although they eventually reconciled. But even during the original run of the series, William Shatner got mad that Leonard Nimoy got more fan mail than he did. And back in the 60s, they measured by just the bags of fan mail that you got, right? So he was starting to feel very uncomfortable because originally it was just starring William Shatner. That was it. He was the lead, right? He had done Claudius and also stuff on stage, and he was going to be the leading man. And all of a sudden, who's this guy that's all of a sudden getting more fan mail that they want Spock, right? So in a way, over time, they kind of figured out, a good working relationship. They figured it out. But Star Trek really had two leads. It was Kirk and Spock, right? And then you can see that represented with how Spock, as a character, there's already been 3 iterations of him. Leonard Nimoy, then Zachary Quinto in the 2009 movie, which he did a fantastic job, and then Ethan Peck as the Strange New Worlds Discovery Spock, which has also done an excellent job. 3 iterations of Spock, right? He showed up how many times throughout the Star Trek universe, right? Or alluded to, right? The role that he plays, right? Even in the most recent Strange New Worlds, right? Literally, Pike says, he plays such a big role, you cannot alter history around it in a way that, only a show that's going into its 56th year can kind of have those types of legacy characters, right? So you can kind of see why Spock is so pivotal. And then on top of that, not just Spock himself as a character, but the archetype of a Spock type character is then very popularized. So Data is clearly like, man, what's the Spock analog? Let's bring in Data, right? Arguably, that's why, although Deep Space Nine is my favorite, you can't really argue the fact that Next Generation is the most successful spin-off, right? Arguably even more than the original series in terms of overall popularity, because I think it takes that Kirk-Spock dynamic or the Spock dynamic and elevates it, but it's still a play on it, right? Data still is that play and that interplay, right? And then you see it back in 2009, like when they went to reboot the universe. Where did they go to? They went back to Kirk and Spock, right, and really focused on Spock. And then Strange New Worlds is another thing. They went back to that too, right? So in a lot of ways, I think it's a very universal, it's a relatable feeling, caught between two worlds. I think for the most part, they do a terrific job of exploring that dichotomy. I think what's important to remember about Vulcans is not that Vulcans don't have emotions, it's that they have to control them because they have so much emotions. They have to control. It's not that they're emotionless and flat. And I think the only critique I would have overall is with how they kind of approach duality is, why is there a duality and the nature of the duality? Meaning, why is it always between like, it's either rage or just, I gotta have no emotion whatsoever. It's just kind of holding in that rage, right? Why does it have to be that? Why does it have to always be just those two emotions? Why can't it be the range of emotion? How about the range, of love and all those affection, which is alluded to in the original series? This side of paradise where Spock goes down to that planet and feels love because of spores. I mean, it is there, but it's often reinforced as like, I'm just holding in all this anger, right? And if I'm let loose, I'm going to be like the Hulk, right? And you see that sometimes in modern iterations of Spock, when he lets go, he's just kind of like,
you never loved her.
I guess is, in my opinion, a little overplayed, right? It's a very overplayed trope, right? And then the other thing that can be a little overplayed too, and you see it maybe a little bit in Voyager, not with Vulcans, but with like half Klingon, half humans, is just kind of like this loathing. Like I loathe my non-human side. I loathe, this, that.
I grew up in a colony on Keswick 4. My mother and I were the only Klingons there. And that was a time when relations between the homeworld and the Federation weren't too cordial. Nobody ever said anything, but we were different. And I didn't like that feeling.
And that in of itself is also a trope too. Like you can't reconcile the two halves, two different cultures, multiple cultures, right? Too. But with that said, I think the reason why people go back to it constantly is because it's such a rich well to draw on for character. So I think in the totality, I think you let the material speak for itself. The reason why Spock is so central in so many things is because of the way Leonard Nimoy inhabited that character. In a lot of ways, there are many people that could play Kirk, but one would be hard pressed to find another person that could play Spock, the original Spock, the way that he played Spock, meaning Leonard Nimoy, right? So I think that was the crux of the matter, is that there was only one Nimoy as Spock, and that was a real irreplaceable character. But of course, everyone else added it too, of course. But I think that is what elevated it beyond just a Lost in Space. It elevated beyond just a forbidden planet, and that's where it took it to the next level, which is why we're still talking about it in 2022.
Yeah, I think that's a really huge point that you're touching on there. That was also standing out to me just in watching both of these iterations, having watched the latest season of Strange New Worlds, is this piece of duality around the character of Spock. And I feel like the motion picture seemed to do a pretty good job of not that kind of resorting to rage. You have the scene towards the end where when he wakes up after having made a mind meld with V'ger, he's laughing at first, actually, and he's crying for V'ger at those points, but he's kind of talking about how he sees himself in V'ger, and that like wanting more, and essentially wanting more because if he tries to be one thing or other, it's not his full self. I feel like in Star Trek 2009, you have the one line that's said to Spock at the end by Sarek.
You're right.
Because he says,
right.
You will always
be a child of two worlds. I am grateful for this. And for you.
Which again, you can read that in a lot of ways. I think, again, it's interesting how a lot of times the movie is framing it as Spock is one thing, or Spock is, he's either there's the Vulcan side and there's the human side, and it's one or the other, constantly in battle with one another. I contrast that with Strange New Worlds, when you have that one recent conversation with the Dr. Aspen character talking with Spock. And they say essentially, all species put things into
boxes. It's like you're either this or you're that, and sometimes we act a certain way to fit people's expectations, but that's not necessarily who we are. And sometimes, like on the bridge just now, it can limit us.
You are proposing I better balance my human and Vulcan natures.
I'm saying maybe you're neither.
That is nonsensical. If I'm not human or Vulcan, what am I?
I mean, that's not my question to answer.
So there's this idea that perhaps there isn't, it's not this binary of things, but there's actually something to think about in terms of like who Spock is Spock. And something in that.
Yeah, and I think if we think about how Spock functions formally in the 1979 film versus the 2009 film, it gets at some of this of what makes him so compelling, right? Like particularly in at least for me in the 1979 film, right? Because Will, as you were talking about earlier, Spock is himself, in terms of like the way that film works in its like character system, supposed to kind of be like in some ways an aspect of Kirk, right? You have Kirk and McCoy, right?
Mhm.
They are already these two aspects of Kirk. So in this weird way, like Kirk's psychology is also sort of split, but it is externalized for the viewer, right? And McCoy as a character is mostly stable in terms of being this externalization of Kirk's of an aspect of Kirk's personality. But Spock is like very unstable in that, whereas like he himself like can't help but become a character, right? Like he can't simply be this logical side of Kirk's considerations, right? He himself then splits into these like logical and emotional sides. So it's supposed to be sort of in some ways this externalization of Kirk, this sort of like this kind of like foil character to define Kirk against, because of the sheer like impossibility of actually embodying logic, right? Sort of like erupts into being such a more complex character, right? It ends up kind of stealing the show in 79. Then the issue in 2009, right, is they know that's already happened. So they're doing it intentionally, right? Like that film is, I feel like, much more so knows that Spock is the star of the show, and is sort of doing these different like kind of subversions where Spock is being put into positions that we're expecting Kirk to be put into. It's kind of withholding Kirk becoming getting into the positions we expect, right? But because it's doing that, it's essentially sort of like taken that weird diagram I was just mapping in my head of like you have Kirk branching out to McCoy and Spock, and then Spock internally branching out. And it's kind of putting the Spock's internal branching like to the top, but then Kirk is still there. It just ends up not quite working as coherently. Whereas like part of what makes Spock work so well in 79 is because he's not the protagonist, but he's sort of like becomes the protagonist in a way, because he's just like he so embodies the issues that the film is trying to deal with.
He becomes the key, right? He becomes the key.
Yes.
Right. And that's why the movie works so well, right? At the very start of it, he's on Vulcan, undergoing the Kolinar discipline to purge himself all emotions. The final epitome, hypothesis of what he wants to do, right? But by the end of that movie, it's like the exact reverse, right? It's, you know, him crying, him laughing. This simple emotion is beyond V'ger's comprehension, right? It's actually, this is something that this other the ultimate logical being, which spoke to him telepathically from Vulcan, that's why he came back. The one thing that can reach them is actually the one thing he's trying to purge, right? There's that symmetry that happens. And then in 2009, it is, you're right, you know, Spock does play front and center. That relationship is front and center. And, you know, giving him that relationship with Uhura and that thing, you know, it's a fun spin. I actually like 2009 for what it is in a lot of ways. But you can really tell that it's really just a remix of that, right?
Yeah.
But it's a good remix because we like the original mix, and it's a good spin on it. And the actors, the strongest thing about 2009 is the acting, the performances that they casted really well. And it's only let down in the fact that arguably the movies have become very formulaic, right? JJ is the ultimate formula person, right? In when he's making these types of movies. So he's very good at crafting those really, you know, action-packed sequences, right? And there's an actual budget now, right? There's an actual money, there's actual involved, looks really good, whatever you debate about his visual style, right? But in a way, it doesn't seem per se like it's really hitting any new territory. And arguably taking like the more shallow aspects of kind of like the characters and putting them in interesting ways. The character that the actors, Chris Pine and Zach, are going to do a lot with what they're given. but it's not the best script of just like, oh, Kirk's a hothead and what have you, and Spock is the calm, cool, logical person. Like that's like, again, someone that I think at a very surface level, that's what it is, because in reality, the original series Kirk, and you kind of see it, which is why I like the Paul Wesley version of Kirk in Strange New Worlds. He's actually a tactician. First and foremost, he's actually very smart. He's very confident in what he is. He's very confident in what he is, but he's not hot-headed for the sake of being hot-headed, right? You see this in the original Balance of Terror and all those other things. He's actually very sharp, right? And there's allusions to Kirk being like best in his class and like read all the time, like he was a giant nerd, right? He's just very confident in his intellect. It's not a brashness, a bravado, like, you know, Top Gun, right? And I think that's where, you know, it's contradictory, right? Like that is kind of what brought in new audiences. It's fun. It's a summer movie. I get that, right? And it's enjoyable, watchable, but that's not really what the Kirk character really was. Just like in the same way, the Spock character really isn't like, I'm trying to keep the rage in me from letting loose. That's not really what Spock's about, right? So I think that's why for all of, you know, and then 2009 did revitalize a moribund franchise after Enterprise, right? So credit where credit's due, but in a way, it doesn't quite get to what Kirk and Spock and the entire essence of what that is, because it's just trying to be a fun movie and try to, and then this is also a criticism, I think, of other media too. They got to get the origin story done in one movie. There's no time to let everything breathe, right? So that's why you got to have I think the biggest complaint about 09 is like, he's captain at the end, like already, like the crew's already set up, right? It's too neat, right? As opposed to just like, this is just it would work better if this is just the beginning, right? But of course they can't do that because like, we got to get them in the exact same places. We got to have Chekhov in there too, although Chekhov didn't come until the second season of the original series. We got to have him in there too. It's just like, that's the movie franchise-itis, which has only gone worse since then. But I think that's the 09's greatest weakness there, is that it has to reset up everything perfectly in one movie. And that's, you know, for better and for worse, that's what it is.
Yeah. I feel like there's almost a sense at some points in 09 that there's this predetermination almost at play, you know, where this must happen. They must meet one another. And you can have, you know, some more direct of that of Spock saying like, actually, I want to put you and young Spock in the same room, Kirk, because like you work great with one another. There's, you know, some that are a bit more of a stretch that you just have to do narratively, like you said, to get them all in the same room. Like, oh, Scotty is on this planet, and so he's, you know, joining us that way. I think it's also, I wouldn't call it, you know, a victim of your own success, but I think it's a reality that, you know, Star Trek 09 coming out, you had at that point, you know, about 50 years of Star Trek in the cultural zeitgeist. And so in some regards, Kirk is not only Kirk from the original series and the films, he's also Kirk as a cultural figure. Spock in the same. He's not only Spock from those films and the original series, but he's a cultural figure. And I think that that plays into perhaps some of the decisions that were made, as well as what you said of like, one of the goals of the film is to draw people in. And so you can't just rely on what has been established in the original series in the films. You need to rely on that cultural feeling that people have about those characters. I think that honestly, you know, I can think of all the hypotheticals in my head of how do you do the sort of soft reboot that they did in 2009 without making a ton of people angry. And it's, to me, pretty impressive that they were able to thread that needle of drawing in the past and trying something new out. I think there are limitations with it, but it's also impressive that they kind of cracked the code of how to do that. You know, doing the multiverse far before the you know, Disney took the corporate approach to that. So yeah.
The novelization adds a lot of this interesting flair. I highly recommend people read it. If you can get their audiobook version, there's a great audiobook version of it too. But it's written from, even the novelization itself is written from a meta perspective. So Gene Roddenberry is writing it as a character in the Star Trek universe, right? So Gene Roddenberry is basically like an editor that is talking to Admiral Kirk, who's telling him the original 5-year mission, the stuff that you saw on TV are actual logs that the people of the Federation followed, but they're not exactly 100% accurate. It's a little bit exaggerated. It's wild. It's wild for something that in 1979. Yeah, these are all in author's footnotes. So there's author's footnotes as Gene Roddenberry, the character editor in the Star Trek universe. There's also the Admiral Kirk's footnotes too, as well. They touch upon the Kirk Spock like shipping thing, like Thyla thing, which talks about that relationship of how, like, it can be interpreted as more than just platonic. Like Gene writes about that. Gene writes about these interesting nuggets about, like, he was named, after his mother's love coach, right? That there's something in the future where they have love coaches, right? They have something about new humans, about how they are more intellectual than Starfleet. In fact, they're so advanced intellectually that they're actually weirdly unfit to be Starfleet personnel and Starfleet commanders, because they end up just abandoning their post when they go out to explore the stars and meeting even higher intellects, right? And that you actually need a quote unquote more conservative, less intelligent, less intellectually agile human to actually man the Starfleet, right? There is a whole subplot to, in 1979, remember that transporter scene where Commander Sonak, it's pretty gruesome, right? And about, what materialized in the live long. The other person on that transport pad in the novelization is actually Kirk's lover, right? There's a lover, right, that he has. And there's an entire subplot about how that lover was a commander in Starfleet and was being used by Admiral Nagura, who's only referenced in the movie once. That Admiral Nagura used and kind of played politics with this commander to get Kirk to stay at the desk job at Starfleet Command in order to boost the popularity of Starfleet, because there was a distaste for Starfleet being a little more conservative, being a little more reactionary, and promoting Kirk to Rear Admiral to be at Starfleet headquarters after the 5-year mission was a publicity coup, right? This is in the novel, right, to this movie, right? And it adds all this extra stuff. But what is interesting about this, and obviously Gene did it for money too, he got paid a lot of money to do this, but I think what's interesting about this is that it adds some really great world building that I don't think is really possible in something like 2009. Like the New Humans idea, it's very much reminiscent of that time period of the 60s and 70s of, I think, Gene, like I said, it's apocryphal. I actually don't think it's true, but people talked about, like, when they interviewed Majel Barrett Roddenberry, his wife, who also played Christine Chapel in Number One, near his death, right? Apparently she was quoted that saying that Gene was like sympathetic to Mao, right? And sympathetic to like the People's Republic of China, right? And that's, apocryphal, right? I'm not sure if that's actually true, but I did read it somewhere in like a star log. I did see it somewhere, like it was mentioned on a cruise in the 80s, right? But I think what is apropos about Roddenberry is that he grew up, he became the writer that he was, the creator that he was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And there's a tremendous amount of social ferment in the 60s and 70s and 80s from 1968 onwards, right? Into the 70s. What happened to the Black Panthers? What happened to SDS? What happened to, all of that, right? And that was the milieu of which people were creating pop culture, right? That was the milieu of which this was happening, right? The Vietnam War, obviously, civil rights, obviously, right? So I think Roddenberry, in a lot of ways, was like a utopian socialist, although he probably wouldn't even call himself a socialist, but wanted a better world, thinking a lot about futurism, thinking about how we can outgrow our infancy. That's basically what Next Generation was in the first 2 seasons. That's what that was, right? So the New Humans idea, it's like the most Marxist, most communist, in the sense that it actually puts into writing the idea that social norms, social behaviors can change over time based off the material conditions. And that's what historical materialism is about. That ideas don't come out of nowhere. It's not independent of matter and the material conditions in which it exists. In fact, it comes from that, right? So if the material conditions of Earth in the 23rd century are different, then perhaps there would be a new type of human. We would expect that. Of course there would be, right? Just like we've evolved since the 1700s, right? There would be a new development, right? A higher form of communism, higher form of development, right? So again, it's a bit convoluted to make that analysis, but it's not, I don't think, far-fetched to say like, that's interesting. Those are ideas that are of that time period, where in the 70s and 80s, they were thinking of that, right? Because at that time, there was a thinking of, even if you're a liberal, liberalism had a utopian frontier, that even with their liberalism, it posited something very revolutionary down the road. Fast forward to 2009, you can match it almost point by point with the decay of capitalism and the crisis of confidence, all the bourgeois institutions. Like from Star Trek 6, right? And I know I'm jumping around, but I think Star Trek 6 is a great thing, because Star Trek 6 is in a lot of ways like the perfect liberal movie. And it has some like, and it also shows you the failures of liberalism. Everything about it, Gorkon is clearly cribbed from Gorbachev, the wall, all that kind of stuff, right? Like that's what it's cribbed from, right? You know, and the end of history, right? The way that movie ends, it's basically like, it's like space Francis Fukuyama saying like, you know what, we've done it. We did it, guys. We defeated space communism. That's what the Klingon Empire was. We defeated it. It's nothing but gravy from here on out, right? Oh. And what happens, right? What happens since 1991 and Star Trek 6, right, is you have none of that playing out, none of this playing out. And then you go into the 2000s and you have 9/11 and you have the war in Iraq, the war on terror. The reason why Enterprise is the way Enterprise was is because of that, right? It began that descent into just like liberalism was like, I thought we would have figured this out. I thought we would be in the stars and we would have a space UN, everyone would get along, right? And like the exact opposite, which is why you get something like Picard, right? Which is in a way, I like Picard in a lot of ways. I think he actually gets a bad rap, but it really is, you can kind of tell like these are liberal writers that are like Michael Chabon. It's like depressed. He's depressed about the state of the world. And I don't blame him. I'd be depressed too. If I was a Marxist, I'd be like, wow, what am I doing? Right. So it's reflected into like Picard, right? He's like, he is defeated. He's broken, right? There's interesting things there though, because there's a Marxist way to look at that too. But I think it's reflected in the fact that liberals don't see a way out. Their way out was they thought Star Trek was going to become Star Trek just because we could have a nice speech. Picard can have a nice speech in the ready room observation lounge, and we could speech our speech a fair way out of this, and that didn't happen, right? So that's why you kind of see Star Trek taking the direction that's taking, right? It's because it doesn't know how to write a better world. And you see that in The Expanse, you see that in Battlestar Galactica, you see that in all those other stuff, right? But the reason why Star Trek is Star Trek and why we're still not talking about, as much as I like Babylon 5, the reason why we're not talking about Babylon 5 50 plus years later is because Star Trek is a little different, because it had that utopianism, right? That radicalism of the 60s, right? And now it's not quite there. And you see it in 2009 was, I think, the most clear-cut way for people to say, you know what, we got to reboot this thing and get rid of quote unquote the stuff that doesn't work, which is the speechifying, which is like that kind of stuff. It's too serious for people, right? And like they sort of did it, but then they kind of then clearly didn't know what to do with it. That's what happened. Right? 2009, they were actually able to thread that needle, like Ethan said, and then that's why afterwards they're like, what do we do after this? They didn't have a second act. And that's why Into Darkness was like a weird. It's like what? Like what? That's what you do with the follow-up to that movie. It's such a letdown because they don't know what other stories to tell, because they've already done their riff on one thing, but they can't keep riffing on it. And if they just keep on riffing on stuff, you have diminishing returns, a la Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan, right? So I think Star Trek is slowly starting to get there with Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks in a lot of ways, but you can really see like liberals are going through it, and you see it in the writing of Star Trek. They're just like, how do we write this world when we don't even know like this is even possible anymore? So I sympathize in that way, because it allows people to explain like, guys, like there's no technological answer. to getting that Star Trek future. It's a political struggle, guys.
Yeah.
And that's what liberals don't understand, because they're still in the, we just got to vote against Trump and that'll be it, right? But that's not how it works, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's interesting because the plot of the motion picture, on the surface, it seems like it could be like an idealist plot, right? It's about encountering this like higher form of consciousness, right, in V'ger. But then V'ger turns out to be, spoiler alert, since we didn't do a full plot synopsis, the Voyager spacecraft, right? Or like
6.
satellite, Voyager 6, right?
Yeah.
The letters have like kind of scraped off to make V'ger. So
quick aside, I think it's funny how like the alien world, the mechanical world that the Voyager 6 probe encounters, like could build that thing around V'ger, but couldn't like smudge off the dirt to say like, oh, it's Voyager. Anyways, sorry. Go on, Devin.
But that's all to say that it originally seems to be doing this very idealist thing about just like encountering this sort of like transcendence and this higher form of consciousness. But that higher form of consciousness proves to be rooted in human labor, human effort, human creation, right? Like it's sort of like humanity encountering itself again, right? And originally, like, it makes me think of the first line of Capital about, encountering the world as an immense collection of commodities, right? And sort of originally encountering this object as something other, as something that comes from external from oneself, that then turns out to be like, oh no, like this is a made thing. And even, what is his name? The guy that nukes himself into the computer. Sorry. Decker. Sorry. And like even Decker kind of doing this sort of very sort of like kind of romantic quasi-death of ascending to this higher consciousness. As you say, there's like a utopianism to that like under a materialist analysis is rooted in the real struggles that were going on in the history in which the film was made, that allow it to imagine that in a way that's not pure idealism. Whereas again, then we go to 2009 and it's like, this is a film that it's actually a really interesting film to me in ways, because it's not just a film of repetition. It's a film about repetition that knows it's about repetition. Like it knows it's a remake and it's like playing with that idea, but it's also kind of trapped in it. So it has to go into all these kind of weird, like time travel paradoxes and multiverse things to sort of plottify this like duty of capitalism essentially that it has to remake something, to like reinvigorate this cultural product.
Yeah. I also just think of like some of those themes when you think of Star Trek the motion picture being made in 1979, that question of, it's almost this post-positivist idea that you can simply quantify the entirety of the universe and you will have all the solutions. Maybe one of the reasons why it really perhaps is resonating with people more and more is you kind of see where we have gone as a society with this attempt to quantify and equate everything to this very particular idea of, what Jeff Bezos would call efficiency and things along those lines, where it's very apparent the limitations of that approach as you revisit this film. That maybe a general audience wouldn't necessarily see in 1979. I could be wrong, but I think like the limits of that, trying to turn everything into numbers and values and losing the human element of that, recognizing you're losing the human element by doing that, and you will never be able to truly know everything by quantifying in that way is something that becomes pretty evident when you see demonstrably how that quantification of every aspect of life that folks have to deal with becomes very clear in our current times.
Yeah. And I mean, this comes out too. This is like a high watermark of like automation discourse in the United States, right? This is, I think, something that a lot of viewers would have been well aware of And, just aesthetically, this is such an inefficient film, right? Like it's luxuriates in these long shots of just sort of like things you can't even really describe. They like have to be seen. Like, I don't know what kind of words to put them in for the viewers, because it's just like these like kind of like images of this craft that is moving through space. And like, I don't know how they did any of that stuff. Also, like, I was just like sitting there watching it. I was like how in 1979 did they like make these shapes move in this way? I have no idea. But like, so much about this film is about sort of like having you sit with those images. So at least like formally, I think maybe unconsciously also, but it's like it's pushing against this sort of efficiency discourse in some way. This valorization discourse, really. Like,
yeah, and I think art is made from the time period that it's made. So I think it'd be very interesting. It's something I've been meaning to do, is now that I've watched director's edition 4K, like then to watch the theatrical cut as is and see what the difference is. And I think there's gonna be a certain charm to it that holds it, but you can kind of still see that obviously it's been 40 years since then, right? But at the same time, they had to do it. They actually worked ridiculous amounts of overtime to do it, and people were like physically broken because of it. People were like got into the hospital because of it, because that's also insane too, right? Like, the reason why that is because Paramount sold this movie to do this, right? And they would have been sued into oblivion if they didn't release it. So like, again, the profit motive like propelled them to just release this movie as is, unfinished, right? Literally had to be, edited together wet and then dropped off to this for the premiere in Washington, DC. And, all this type of stuff, I think, shows you that, despite all this type of stuff, that what the true artistry of it is like the crafting, making of these types of universes, right? That's like the incredible legacy of learning about like the history of the motion picture, how it was made, and all the people that were behind it, the unsung heroes that literally had to put these models together. And even for the newer movies too, right? There's an amazing amount of artistry with CG too. And the point is, what universe are they trying to inhabit and create? They're creating universes, right? I think in a lot of ways, there's a reason why that people still don't talk about Avatar, although Avatar is like the movie that made the most money ever. It was visually, I remember seeing it in 3D, like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, technology, this is pretty amazing. But yet, what lasting cultural resonance does Avatar have? And 15 years later, they're doing a sequel. But like, does anyone really care about that though? I mean, honestly, right? Like James Cameron, all kind of stuff, right? I think there's something to be said about the fact that there really is no cultural resonance to the greatest movie that made the most money of all time, right? Why does Star Trek still have resonance, right? Why did it get saved in the 70s by the fandom, right? And I think because it goes back to, we're going full circle now, it's like the universe that it posited, right, was fundamentally, they don't say it in all the press releases when they say, oh, Star Trek talks about a world where, we all get along and, things will be better. Like, it's very sanitized, right? In the way they talk about it in conventions. What they're essentially saying is that humanity figures a way out of the banality and the cruelty of wage labor and the, surviving hand to mouth, is that you can truly, only by literally getting out of that, can you actually unlock the true potential of humanity. The human venture is just beginning, but can only begin with the end of capitalism, right? That's the left unsaid, but like, that's the thing, is like, you think the Enterprise, when you see it in space dock, whether it's in 1979 or in 2009 in Iowa, like, do you think that was built with SpaceX or Elon Musk or Blue Planet or Bezos? Like, no, like, that was probably done because it was a planned economy, that they moved resources around to do this. And it wasn't because of different countries competing with each other, right? The nation state is, as Marx says, we understand it's a fetter on development. It's an artificial, inhumane, cruel fetter on human development and creativity, right? There's none of that within the United Federation of Planets. Like, we convene the best minds. creatively, intellectually, engineering, science, like, yeah, there's no competition. Like, oh, well, he's, there is no like, oh, there's no Americans in that time period, right? They don't refer to themselves like, I'm from, like, it's almost like colloquially, it's an anachronism, like, oh, I'm from what used to be known as like Alaska, United States, like, right? And that's part of the charm, because it's supposing something like, oh, we can actually get beyond this. And I think that's what makes it kind of last. And then, of course, there's all the different iterations, because there's also tremendous character work, the actors and everything else that comes into it. And like the whiz bang stuff too, of course, right? All of that, it's that secret sauce that makes it what it is. But at the end of the day, it's about these people figuring it out, right? Working together, right? But they don't explain it, right? They don't say how you get there. They'll just say like, we just logic our way there. We just appeal to our better emotions. And, like, it is very idealistic. Like First Contact is very idealistic. Oh, if Vulcans come, aliens come, we'll somehow figure it out. We're not alone. We're not alone in the universe, and that will be the realization for us to get along. Completely utopian, completely idealistic. But in a way, that doesn't matter to me as a Marxist. This is where it comes to what I was saying earlier, how being a Marxist makes me a better Star Trek fan. It's like, I don't twist myself in pretzels to try to explain why Zephyr Cochrane looks different in First Contact than Metamorphosis, because I think that's a deep cut for Ethan. Like, they're two different people, right? Like, they don't look alike at all. But
no.
But you take what you can get from, like, how do we get to this one world government with no national borders that have eliminated want? They talk about how it's a utopia, right, on Earth. Like, that's pretty radical, and that's just like the most basic premise of Star Trek, right? And I think that's just an opening to explain to people, like, it's not just something that is nice. It's a nice fiction. I think that's where you get people to really think, where like, it's not just, and the thing that I always encounter and I always enjoy, at least, arguing against, I think people can do a good job arguing against, is like, there's only a technological solution to this. The only reason why Star Trek can be Star Trek is because they have magic technology and they can just replicate things. And that's how you get to post scarcity, which in of itself is a dodge, but it's a dodge that is easily refutable to say that, is that not true right now of the productive forces? We can feed everyone. We can house everyone. It's actually not that hard. It's not that hard. We've already done it. In fact, food is thrown away, housing is destroyed. Like, it's the exact opposite, right? So it's not a question of technology and know-how. We've already done it. It's it's a political question to struggle, and that's Star Trek. And Star Trek never gets to that point, though, and that's where liberalism really shows, because it doesn't. But on some level, I like to keep it that way until we can actually nationalize Star Trek under workers' control. It's going to be written by liberals and written by Paramount and CBS, right? If they attempt to explain it, it's going to be like The West Wing in space or Hamilton in space. It's going to be terrible. Yeah. It will be terrible. It will be terrible, right? So I prefer them to keep it vague, keep it like, we don't have money, we don't know what that is, and we all work to better ourselves. Great, keep it that way so we can fill in the gaps, and we'll fill it in the right way. But I think that's the thing that I think people sort of get. They deep down get, like, that's why they're fans of this thing, because they're just like, yeah, they don't seem to struggle. They have problems in the future. They still get arguments. That's the thing that is a misnomer, is that there was conflict in Star Trek. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy argued all the time, right? But this was a dynamic of trying to get the best ideas, and that would happen in any society, right? But people are not wanting. People are not. Are not vicious towards each other. There is a development in both technology and in culture and society that people are better, right? So how do we get to that, right? Is it just an aspirational thing, or is it based off of something that needs to be changed? And the answer, of course, I would say, and I think you would agree, is socialist revolution, right? And that's how you get to a united federation of planets, right? I always say it's actually united. It's actually the United Socialist Federation of Planets. They don't say the socialist, but it's implied. It's implied it's a federation, right? Governed by worker Soviets, governed by that type of stuff, right? But they don't talk about it. But I mean, how else could you run this thing? Are there like a space Microsoft in the future? Is there a space Amazon? I mean, there is. It's called the Ferengi, right? And they're the antagonists, right? So there's so many ways to slice and dice this, but I think the Marxism just flows so easily in something that, the story of Star Trek, just creates such an easy entry point for people.
Hear, hear.
I want you to try something for me. Take a sip of this.
What is it?
A human drink. It's called root beer.
I don't know.
Come on. Aren't you just a little bit curious? What do you think?
It's vile.
I know. It's so bubbly and cloying and happy.
Just like the Federation.
But you know what's really frightening? If you drink enough of it, you begin to like it.
It's insidious.
Just like the Federation.
Do you think they'll be able to save us?
I hope so.
Yeah, if I could just very briefly add on to what Will was saying, I just want to really put a pin in how important it is to think about how the solutions to these problems are not technological, right? Because what's the thing in Star Trek? It's the matter replicator. Is that what it's called? What's the thingy?
Yeah, it's the replicator.
Yeah. The replicator, yeah. But at the end of the day, what's the replicate? If we're okay, what is the technology we would need to solve human hunger? It's okay, we would need to have the technology to create food and to transport it. Pretty sure those things exist, right? And
refrigerate it, package it up, right? All this type of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But obviously, that is not the barrier that is preventing these kind of things from happening, right? And likewise, you're not going to get your fancy utopian technologies under capitalism either. There's no the social relations are not such where such things will be developed or could be developed, right? The amount of money the amount of research money that goes into male erectile dysfunction, as opposed to lowering the mortality rate of pregnancy and birth, is staggering, right? And and now you can very easily get ED pills by talking to a guy on the internet for 10 minutes, right? Which is, if you've listened to a lot of podcasts that aren't this one, you've heard advertisements about, right? Whereas a lot of maternity technology is still in the 1950s. Why is that the case, right? Is that because we don't have the technological capacity to innovate or to advance that technology, or is it because of social relations, right? And I just wanted to just put an emphasis on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Despite how hard it may be, given this whole conversation, to think about improvements to the motion picture in Star Trek 09, we do have a segment here on the show. We're often harsh to our films, not as harsh to these films because we have a lot of love for the Star Trek films and franchise. But we do have a segment where we try to imagine how we would build back these films better. Hashtag build back better. Now I'll say this, I say this every single episode. There's a lot of cross talk on Twitter when we're using our hashtag build back better. There's a lot of stuff about infrastructure that I don't know why people keep using our hashtag in that way. But
yeah, I don't know who Joe Manchin is. I don't care who he is unless he's going to help us make these movies better. That's what the hashtag's about.
So, given that, hashtag build back better, if you could go back and add something, change something, remove something to the motion picture in Star Trek 09, what would that be? Devin, to kind of give us an example, could you like if you could do that with the motion picture and Star Trek '09, what would you do to hashtag build it back better?
Yeah, so honestly, I loved the motion picture. There was a part of me that did want more of the universe, right? But I know that's what I can go to the TV show for some of that. As like just like as a film, fantastic. I would say just even less dialogue, even more shots of like space milk or whatever was going on. I loved it. Or just make it longer. I will just like sit in front of that film for like 3 hours and just marinate in 1970s special effects, which we should also note is also a labor issue, right? Because part of the move to CG is not just, it's about that CG workers are not unionized, right? Star Trek '09, we didn't get too much into like the plot of Star Trek '09, but my big change would be that Nero successfully ends the universe so that Star Trek Into Darkness never happens.
Not a lot of love for the. Did you see that one in theaters, Devin?
I actually saw Star Trek Into Darkness in theaters in Seoul, South Korea, when I lived there because, I didn't live in Seoul. I lived outside of Seoul. And I got trapped in Seoul overnight because I missed the last train. And instead of paying for a cab, I decided there was like a movie theater that was playing this Into Darkness at like 3 a.m. So I went and watched that. It was like sold out, by the way.
Wow.
And then got like the 6 a.m. train home. But, the entire time, I just remember being incredibly tired and being like, oh, he's Khan. Oh, wait, they're saying, he's not Khan? Okay, it really seems like he's Khan.
I like how they kept on insisting that it wasn't going to be Khan, that there was going to be a brilliant twist, and it just being like, no, we were just lying to you. Like it made it worse. Like if you just said it was, but somehow like, oh no, it's not. We're smarter than that. But end up being that, like, oh, makes me hate it even more.
Yeah. That's fair. Now, as you can tell, Will, sometimes Devin jokes around a bit with how he would change these films for the better. I take it much more seriously. I do agree with Devin with the motion picture that I'm a huge fan, so thinking of what you would change, you don't want to ruin any of the elements that do make it work. I do think, though, if I could change one thing to the motion picture, I think there should have been a scene where the Enterprise security team had like a pickup football game, given what those uniforms look like, they were ready to go. So just include the scene. So maybe one day we get a even more extended edition beyond the director's cut that has that pickup football game scene. You're seeing the picture now, Devin?
I'm looking at the picture now. I was like trying to remember what you were talking about, and then wow.
Something I love with Star Trek, are the silly costumes and
it's part of its charm, though, right? So everything, like I said, that has like a retro, like it's retro cool now, right? To have like this like space leather helmet on it, but like it works. You're like, oh, I believe it. Like it's like laser tag. Like they put like a laser tag thing. Like, you know what? I believe it. It has become like this cool thing.
Yeah.
Much like in a way, the fact that those screens are clearly just blinking, many of them are just blinking lights, right? There are no LEDs yet, right? But the idea that it's so advanced, like it's an interface that is just clearly just various forms of shapes and blinking lights, which I think is part, again, of why it can age better over time. But I think it's my turn with what I would change. I think.
Well, you missed. Sorry, I didn't do Star Trek '09.
My bad.
Pretty sure. I think again the film is good for what it is and how it came together. I just think like maybe we should have just let J.J. Abrams film Star Wars in 2009, since he clearly wanted to do that eventually, and I feel like he perhaps saw Star Trek as his way to show that he could do that sort of franchise. So that he then got the green light to do Star Wars. So just let him do a Star Wars a few years earlier.
But did you see Rise of Skywalker though? So
don't have him conclude any story. Yeah,
that's true.
We could have a whole story, a whole episode. I know Devin has lots of feelings about the mystery box approach that.
We need to do like a proper. We honestly might just need to do an episode on his TED Talk at some point and not even talk about a movie, just because I will completely unload everything I think about that. But yeah.
I mean, that sounds terrible. Like a J.J. Abrams TED Talk sounds like the Klingon rite of ascension. Like, oh, let's just torch you with paint sticks. Because like the hot take industry, the TED Talk, like all of that is just like it's the worst part of capitalism at this stage, right? That's the energy being exuded by the bourgeois, is that kind of shit. Like, it's insane. Is it my turn to
yes,
okay.
we come to you, Will, for how would you build back these films better?
Right. I actually think I do have I think two legitimate changes I would actually make. I think one with 1979, I think the thing where I would change actually is that I think there was a push towards making it a very serious film, making it like it's a cinematic experience. So there are parts where they ad-libbed a little bit, where Leonard Nimoy ad-libbed a little bit. So there's a scene that's actually not included. This is all behind the scenes stuff where, at the end of the movie, they're like, we're going to take you back to Vulcan. And, he basically said, Dr. McCoy is going to stay on the ship. And then Spock basically says, well, if Dr. McCoy is staying on the ship, then my presence here is obvious, right? And it was kind of, but it was set in a way that it was reminiscent of the banter that they had in the original series, right? And it was something that Leonard Nimoy ad-libbed at the end. But the motion picture was so, they were so precise. Everything had to be on the page. They would stop it if it wasn't on the page, right? So they said they're going to cut it, right? And Nimoy apparently said, like, I give you this freely. You're free to take it. Basically saying, like, I give you this gift. Like, I'm making this better. I'm making the material better. You can take it if you want, and if not, that's on you, right? But he was basically saying, like, I also know this character. I also kind of felt it was a little stilted in parts where, like, you can have a serious movie, but you can still have kind of that dynamic, that flair a little bit there too, right? And I think that's something where I think you could have added some of that too, right? At the end, and I think that's one critique of most pictures, like, they don't seem like their characters in the original series, right? And I think there is growth towards the end where that shows, but I think you can show more of it, right? Like, and I think there doesn't have to be like, this is a serious movie and this is what it is. And I think the uniforms too. I think Robert Wise, I like the uniforms, don't get me wrong, but Robert Wise, like, basically said there's going to be a completely muted color pattern. And I think there's a nice in between. There's a nice in between that. But with that said, I actually really like the motion picture stuff. In fact, I think they were arguably saying Kirk's Admiral uniform, I think initially everyone was going to wear a variation of that, but then they just wanted him to wear that, and everyone else kind of had their separate clothes too. So I think there is something interesting to be said about maybe allowing more of that TOS-ness into the motion picture. But when Robert Wise came in, he was like, that wasn't going to happen. Let's redo the uniforms, because they're going to use the Phase 2 uniforms, which I don't know if you see the pictures of it, Ethan. They're very reminiscent. They're actually kind of very Strange New Worlds-esque, right? So I'm like, that's kind of a what if of like what that is. But at the same time, the retro 70s, that space pajamas look is in a way like it's in again, because it does feel like something that's comfortable. We wear those things on deep space missions, right? So
and you gotta love McCoy when he steps off the teleporter with the, ready to go to the disco, ready to hop on the Enterprise, got the full beard.
Exactly right. He's enjoying life. There's even that reference, by the way. I know I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but there's that reference though, like, I was drafted.
Your revered Admiral Nagura invoked a little-known, seldom used reserve activation clause. In simpler language, Captain, they drafted me.
They didn't.
This was your idea. This was your idea, wasn't it?
Bones is a thing out there.
Why is any object we don't understand always called a thing?
Headed this way. Damn it, Bones. I need you.
Right? Which is clearly from that time period. It's 1979, it's 1970, not too far from 1975, right? It was that period, that ferment, right? Where, like, there was that counterculturalness there too, right? And, like, that's interesting. Those are sort that it's only hinted at. all the people wearing those clothes, it was very Logan's Run at Starfleet Academy or Starfleet headquarters. But that's really cool, right? The fact that it looks like humanity is clearly living it up, and there's a different type of humanity than the kind of buttoned up Starfleet. It's all alluded to. That's very interesting. But that's what the only thing I would really change is just kind of let a little bit more of that life into kind of the acting a little bit, a little more improvisation. And then I think for 2009, I think the one thing that would make it better is if it didn't end the way that it was so neat at the end, because they had to, because you could tell they were working backwards. They were like, we need to get Kirk in the chair. Spock is his number one, and everything else, and Sulu there so he can take the shot, and then they sell it in promos. Like that is what they wanted to do, and they work back from that premise, right? Which is a take on it, right? But it's not the most inventive take. It's not the best take. And if you wanted to do a reboot, if you wanted to do like a reimagining, give it some time to actually reimagine it, right? So, you know, it actually doesn't have to be Kirk in the chair when he was a cadet like 2 hours ago, right? Like give it some time, give it maybe a series of movies, right? Give it something else like that. And there is something to be said about that in other scripts that were never made. There was something called Star Trek: The Beginning that was written by Eric Henderson, I think, which talked about a movie, three movie trilogy about the beginning of Star Trek. This is before 09. So this is being pitched after Enterprise. And it was sort of kind of like a predecessor of Kirk. It involved the Romulans, but it was envisioned to be kind of like the Iliad, like a trilogy, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, and that kind of stuff, where there was going to be some time that passed, some growth, right? And it wasn't just going to be, we're going to set the status quo at the very end. So I think they could have done that with that cast, and it would have been, I think, arguably a lot better, because then it would actually lead to something interesting. It would lead to something that would just be an actual maybe series. Maybe that became Discovery, as opposed to just 09 and then nothing for a long time, and still nothing, by the way. There's still no Kelvin universe movies.
I appreciate you doing like actual very good changes that would make a lot of sense for both of those films.
Awesome. Well, and so our final segment of the pod is it's time to dish out the Shia LaBeoufs. So will we rate the films in on a scale of Shia LaBeoufs? You may interpret the scale however you wish. We do this because we did it once and then it became canon. So much like Star Trek 2009, we find ourselves bound by certain canonical pressures. Ethan, why don't you go first?
Yeah. So for Shia LaBeouf's, I would rate the motion picture as Shia LaBeouf from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Because it's a soft reboot. You have the returning principal characters in some regards. You have like a one good-looking young guy who was like sort of intended to, and then most certainly did not carry on the franchise to a new generation of fans. You had like Shia in Indiana Jones, and you had like Decker, who through all these iterations was perhaps going to be much more involved than ended up happening in the motion picture. And so that's how I would rate the motion picture. Would you like me to do 09 as well?
Yeah, sure.
09, I said, was Transformers Shia, where you brought back, they had like Peter Cullen as Optimus Prime. They didn't have Frank Welker as Megatron, though. It's like you have Nimoy comes back as Spock, but you can't also bring back Kirk with Shatner, as much as Shatner was not happy about that. And so otherwise, like this is a much harder reboot, the Transformers, compared to like Indiana Jones was, the kind of softer, like, oh, it's just, a few years have passed. So yeah, that's how I would rate these two films.
It's interesting because I actually rated, I gave Star Trek 09 the Kingdom of Crystal Skull Shia. But, again, I'm, coming a little from outside Star Trek, so I wasn't even thinking of the motion picture in terms of a reboot, But for me, it was really just like that final shot of the Indiana Jones hat like kind of glowing towards Shia LaBeouf, and it's like, you're gonna take the hat, right? To me, was like so analogous to that shot that Will was just talking about, that they clearly like structure the film to create, of like, Kirk in the chair. The motion picture for me was a nymphomaniac Shia, because this is a horny movie, and I say that glowingly, but that Decker guy, it's actually, he's kind of like not horny at all, and then he's like, I'm willing to like evaporate myself into like light so that I can become horny, which is again a lot more extreme now than these ED pills you can get so easily from all the other podcasts. So that's where I went with it. Will, what about you?
Wow. So I think I'm not as familiar with my Shia LaBeouf films. So the scales of it, I'm going to have to use the scales you guys use, because that's basically all the movies I'm familiar with it. Although he was Even Steven, I suppose, back in the day.
Yeah.
Him. But I actually like the first Transformers movie. I actually think it is fun for what it is. So I enjoy his performance in that for what it is, the first one. So in a way, like I don't think I wouldn't use that as a negative, but I would say the Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull is actually a great analogy for Star Trek 09, in the sense that it is manufactured to be like this clear handoff, but didn't lead anywhere. Like there's still like, it didn't really go anywhere because it was so bad. And there was like a really bad Russian accent because of like of Chekhov in 09. And there's like a really bad Russian, like the communist, like evil, wasn't that Kate Blanchett or something, like an evil KGB agent? Like I blocked out most of that movie, but I'm like, that I think that happened, right? And like I'm pretty sure Indiana Jones, like I'm gonna vote for like Eisenhower or something. I'm just like, oh my god, like is this what they're doing with this? It was bad. It was bad. But that's actually a good parallel where like, but here's the thing: Star Trek 09 is a far better movie than Indiana Jones Crystal Skull.
Absolutely.
I'm only using it as a scale of saying, in what Devin was saying, it was clearly manufactured to be a handover and a handoff, which didn't lead anywhere. And I would say with 1979, I would say, I mean, I like the Transformers movie. I think it was, so I'm going to use that as a scale, right? I like Shia LaBeouf in the sense that it was, although there was a Transformers movie in 1984 with a great soundtrack, this was the first live action Transformers movie. It had that scale to it, that the scale of 1979 had. It had the scale. It felt like that. In a lot of ways, I feel like Cybertron is like the V'ger planet, is like the Cyber planet in a lot of ways. I think those are my scales.
Yeah. And like the motion picture, I feel like the Michael Bay Transformers movies are having a little bit of a reappraisal in like a post MCU world. Like, because at the time I feel like a lot of people were like, oh, like Michael Bay is like the Drex of culture, but now people, I think there's been a lot of reassessment of like, oh, well, what these movies are doing is way more interesting than like the 17th Marvel movie. So
it's amazing how if things get worse, then things get reappraised, right? Like, oh, things get even far worse, they get reappraised. But I think with that said, I think I will always be that type of person with Star Trek. So I'm a huge, I lived through the reappraisal of the motion picture, which is what's happening right now. The fact that we're doing this podcast around 1979 has been reappraising that movie. I hopefully will be around for the reappraisal of Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which I think is starting to happen, where, man, there's a lot to like about that movie, guys. It gets a lot of flack, but I mean, what does God need with a starship? God gets shot in the face by a Klingon bird of prey. There's a camping scene where they're talking about marshmallows. It's great. There's like, it is Star Trek and it's campiest, but also Star Trek at its core, but that's a whole nother podcast. But man, Star Trek V is a real gem.
Will, thank you so much for coming on and sharing from a lot of your vast knowledge across these films. We have really appreciated the conversation. I think it's been a really good one that gives folks a lot to think about. and hopefully gives them an excuse to go back and watch Star Trek the Motion Picture, watch Star Trek 09, and all of the other Star Trek properties. I'm gonna convince Devin to go through and do a watch of the Next Generation to kind of get him into the series at some point. So fingers crossed that I can convince him to do that. But Will, to before we close out, would you like to share a little bit about where people can find you, what you are up to? Yeah, before we close out here.
Sure. So as mentioned at the top of the show, I'm the Star Trek columnist my handle is @Boomer9er on Twitter, where I talk about what is advertised, Star Trek and communism, the connections to it. And I also organize politically in real life with Social Revolution, which is the U.S. section of the International Marxist Tendency, which is basically, in some ways trying to rebuild the legacy of the Comintern, the first Communist International, in a lot of ways. So I think that is what I'm doing, and you can find me online talking about all those things.
Will, thank you so much for coming. I will also do a shout out. Your food posts on Twitter are another aspect that you didn't mention, but I think warrant just a mention at the end here that I always get very hungry when you post all of those. So,
well, then mission accomplished for mine.
We don't need a replicator, folks. We know how to make food.
That's a whole thing in Star Trek about how real food tastes better. And Ethan will get you to watch the episode where O'Brien was talking about how his mom used to touch meat with his hands, and Keiko was like, touch meat with your actual hands. It's great. It's a great episode.
Oh wow. Well, Will, thank you again. This was such a fantastic conversation, and I learned a lot. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
We would now like to announce the end of the first chapter of the original series, Volume 1 of...
Oh, I was just being facetious about actually calling it a series or a chapter.
Okay. The point is... we probably should have ended the season a bit ago. This episode got a little delayed, for a number of reasons, but we're going to be coming back in about a month or so, right? When does Prey come out?
Prey comes out on August 5th.
Okay, so we're not going to
direct to Hulu.
We're not going to actually be gone for very long, but just pretend that the long break in between this episode and the Avatar episode was the break between season 1 and season 2. And then we will be back with season 2 as we come full circle, right? That was our first episode, was Predator, right?
It was.
So we will finally be diving into this ill-conceived attempt to make the Predator series deal with Native American issues and colonialism. So yeah, you know where to find us. We're on Twitter @YourTallPod. You can email us at yourtallpod@gmail.com. Tell us what you'd like us to watch or talk about next.
The human adventure is just beginning. Oh, was that too much? The human adventure is just beginning.
There we go, buddy. There we go. All right.